Hello, you fine Bible students and who want to really do some exploration work with the Book of Ruth in the Old Testament right after the Book of Judges. And it is only 4 chapters. I hope you did your homework and have read through the whole book and have refocused yourself on chapter 1, which we are going to focus on today. A couple of very important things about any kind of Bible study is look at your context. I preach about this. I talk about it all the time in Sunday school classes and whatnot. But context is important. But not just in terms of evaluating what the context of the scripture is from, but also the context in which we live today. In preaching, you have the context of the Bible that's important in understanding a passage. But we also prepare a message, a sermon, that speaks to the reality of the congregation and where they are in their lives. For instance, when I look out at the congregation on a Sunday morning, when we're able to look out at the congregation, and I see faces that I know belong to people who are struggling, who are grieving the loss of loved ones, who are maybe don't have a job right now. I see immigrants every now and then who come through. There are people of various colors and creeds that come to church. And what we bring does influence our understanding of the passage that we're dealing with. So do keep that in mind and where you are in this study and see if it speaks to you, pay attention to that and write it down, and maybe you can examine that a little bit more. Just a quick reminder to those of you, in the Book of Ruth, names are very important. Now, we know that names are important in our Christian faith. God knows us by name, and when we baptize a child, we baptize them with their name but not their surname because they are children of God. So that's always been something that we all love in a baptism, is we belong to the family of God. And the name that is given is very important. Even if it's a relative, it's given in the name of the Lord at baptism. So it's very powerful. So if we notice that there is a key player in the Book of Ruth that does not have a name, we need to pay attention to that and try to see, well, why don't they have a name? Also, one thing that we see very prominently in the Book of Ruth, more than in any other Old Testament text, I believe, other than Esther, is the women who have the names. And not just in terms of the story itself, but in terms of the lineage that has brought them to this point. So let's go through some of those names a little bit. Moab, which is the country to which Naomi, the story starts. Naomi and Elimelech went over there with their 2 sons, and they were immigrants to Moab. Let's see. Elimelech is the head of the household as Naomi's husband, and his name means "my God is king." So it's a testimony to who God is in their lives. And Elimelech carries this name. It's like a statement that my God is the king, not the Moabite gods, but my God is king. And Naomi, which is who we named our daughter after, the name, not the person necessarily. The name means gift of joy and pleasure. And I have to admit that there were points in her life when there wasn't a whole lot of joy or pleasure in how she was claiming her life. But now look, she's given birth to 3 babies, and they are a joy and pleasure too, and so is she. It's just a real happy thing. So that's what Naomi means. And then we have Mahlon, Mahlon. And Mahlon was one of their sons, Elimelech and Naomi's sons, and his name means sickly. And he was Ruth's husband. Again, Mahlon didn't marry an Israelite woman. He married a foreigner. And there were a lot of places in the Bible where it says, no, don't you do that. And we'll talk more about those places. But there are also places where the key character in God's plan is a foreign woman, which is very interesting. So Ruth is married to Mahlon, who is sickly. Chilion was married to Orpah. So these were the daughter-in-laws of Naomi. And Chilean means very nice and respectful. So you had a sick son and you had a nice son. Orpha means fawn, and Ruth means friend. Oh my word, the epitome of a friend to her mother-in-law. Neither of them had children. Okay. One of you asked in an email, what is Ephrathites? What are they? Well, these are descendants of from Caleb's wife. Now, Caleb was back there in the wilderness. His name, he was recognized as a man of great courage who thought differently. In Hebrew, Caleb means dog, but he was noted and named for how he looked at life and his faithfulness to God. Well, Ephrathite is Caleb's wife from the house of Judah. Now, why is that a big deal? Because King David was from the house of Judah, and Jesus was a descendant from the house of Judah, as was foretold. So you have that area. Okay, yeah. So the area of Bethlehem was a region where the tribe of Judah lived. And of course, we know Bethlehem as the home of the Savior of the world. And all of these things kind of run together, don't they, throughout the scriptures. Bethlehem, interesting enough, means house of bread. Wow, house of bread. So there was no bread in Bethlehem, and they had to flee to Moab in order to eat and have sustenance. So that's a key part. We're in a famine. They left Bethlehem, the house of bread, and flee to find food. Now, there's another key figure that comes up in later chapter 2. Boaz. Now, Boaz is a great guy, isn't he? He has good reputation. And his name means strength is within him. Strength is within him. And of course, if you read the book, you know that Ruth and Boaz get together. But the strength is his character. He was a real catch for anybody. And he was a person of means, obviously, in his family. Now, we have, later in there, we're going to meet a person called Obed. Obed is the birth, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to save Obed for later in our study. But Ruth is part of the lineage of Jesus and is mentioned in his genealogy, which I think is pretty significant. A woman, as is Caleb's wife, a woman. Just amazing how good God is. Now, moving into this, the book of Ruth, catastrophe, starts with a famine. The first line, during the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So we start in a dismal place, and not just dismal in terms of ability to provide food, but it was hard to live, literally. So a man and his wife, 2 sons, left the place of bread and the house of bread and went to a foreign country that were enemies. Let me turn the page. Yeah. Now, the men die. Catastrophe is even known as catastrophic literature. And this first chapter spells that out big time, doesn't it? So you have Ruth, who is an immigrant now in the opposite direction from Naomi. She's displaced. She doesn't belong to anybody. Her husband is dead, as is Naomi's husband, as is Orpha's husband. The economic disaster that this implies is obvious. A precarious situation. Why? Primarily because they're women. Women technically belong to their husbands. And who was there? There were no men who served as protectors. one of you emailed me and asked about the protector redeemer person, and we know of redeemer in terms of Jesus. And I think that from our perspective of our Christian faith, it does inform our understanding of the Book of Ruth. And we're going to explore redeemer a little further on. But in this context, a woman who did not have a husband was really out on her own, and really had to use her imagination in terms of how to survive. And sometimes that was not a pleasant situation. Now, it could be that they could go back to the house of their father if their husbands died. But Naomi's an old woman and her husband is dead. Then the sons would take care of the mother. But no, the sons died as well. They just weren't strong enough to deal with what was going on. And that left 3 women without a redeemer protector, a husband. Now, Orpah and Ruth were relatively young women, we can judge. Orpah went back to the house of her father, which is often where women would go in that culture if they lost their husbands without a son. So Orpah went back to her father's home, and she could remarry if that was possible, and that would be between families to take her in. So Ruth did not choose to go back to her family. We don't know why. Maybe she didn't have a protector redeemer to go back to, her father or brothers who could take her in and provide for her, redeem her, keep her safe, protect her as a woman who really was just property. So it's a very sad situation economically, physically. It's just very precarious. People who are, what's the word? I can't think of it. It's nighttime, so my brain is being affected by COVID, I think. But it's also has Ruth, who is a foreigner, puts her even in worse circumstances. So who else were foreign women of significance in the Bible? Well, we know that Tamar, who was the daughter-in-law of Judah, who, basically had a child by him while she masqueraded as a prostitute. Yes, in the Bible, there's all kind of wild stories in there. She had twin sons, and from her sons, her one son, Perez, he was the one who took the name of Judah all the way to Jesus. And she's listed in his lineage as well. And she was a foreign woman. So were Esau's wives. So was Joseph's wife. All of these were foreigners. And all of this goes to indicate that foreigners were welcomed in Israel. Were they received that way? Maybe only in the law. But that doesn't mean that people practice the law for these very, I can't find the word again, it's the same one, precarious situations that people are in, these women are in. When she gets there, she is identified as a foreigner. She is Ruth the Moabitess. And that's kind of sad. Now, Naomi knew it was going to be difficult, and more difficult with a woman who was basically going to be serving as her redeemer protector initially, which was just unheard of. So she didn't want Ruth to come back with her. But this covenant that Ruth makes with Naomi, just wholeheartedly, she is in for returning with Naomi, her mother-in-law, who she obviously loved very much. So they go to Bethlehem. And so it's said in the beginning of this chapter that it was during the time of Judges. Scholars go back and forth on that. They think that, yes, it was a true story and situation, but what was the purpose of it? In that context, it might have been to point out when there was resistance to having impure people who were not Hebrew people. that showed that, well, King David himself had foreign blood in him. He wasn't pure. And we know about that purity thing. People throughout the eons have gotten off on the insistence of purity and what it means for them. So it's in the day of Judges, and maybe it's taking place in a different time other than Judges. And we'll talk about that a little more as we go through this. But it was a period that was rough, and people survived or were delivered. And in this case, we're hoping that Naomi and Ruth are delivered from their burdens. Now, in Judges 19, until you can understand the position that they were in, women are treated poorly in Judges. The hearers of the story of Ruth would have known that famine was part of Joseph's story. It was part of Abraham's story. It's a theme, and now here it is in the story of Ruth. Famine and survival, those two go hand in hand. Israel is arid as it is. The Hebrew family moves to Moab. They were likely working in the fields. It was an agrarian society, and what else could they do as an immigrant? Just like immigrants do in our country. When I lived in Florida, of course, and anyone else in North Carolina knows that there is a migration of immigrant labor that come and work the fields and will go up the eastern coast. And then they make their way back down to Florida when the winter crops start coming in to harvest. So this is not an unusual kind of setup for migrants to come in and help. Ruth, in terms of the friend, who we know she was, it also means fullness, but we know she doesn't have a child either. So the fullness in terms of pregnancy and new life, there wasn't anything there. I've been to the Holy Lands. I was there in the winter, and maybe it's different in the spring and summer, but it's a desert. It is a desert with the Jordan River, which is their main source of water to this day. At the mouth of the Jordan River, it's very lush, but very stony. And of course, the Dead Sea, into which it dumps out of the Sea of Galilee into the Dead Sea, it is dead. I mean, nothing grows there. And it's just a different kind of environment than we can even really imagine. I'm so glad I went to that trip. It helps me read the scripture differently. So let's see, I was there. Okay, y'all are so patient. Oh, in this first chapter, we discover that when they get back to Bethlehem, nope, we're not there. I'm jumping ahead to next week. I don't want to do that yet. Okay. Now, another thing about Moab, which must have surprised the readers, is Moabites were seen as enemies of the people of Israel. They did have skirmishes and fights all the time. They were always struggling with each other. They didn't respect one another either. So you got Moabites, and it's very interesting because it points out very clearly that Naomi's family was welcomed by these Moabites who were not to be trusted at all. So they were welcomed by the foreigners, whereas it could very well be that Israel did not welcome the foreigners from Moab. So just kind of keep that as a possibility in your brain as we're thinking about context. So would Bethlehem welcome Ruth? They didn't know that when they were going toward Bethlehem. Her history is problematic in terms of where she is. Naomi is literally the protector of Ruth, who doesn't have any rights at all. They really lean on each other for survival. And as we will see in chapter 2, their mind, they were sharp women, and they knew how to live in the circumstances that they found themselves in Bethlehem. It's very interesting. You will find in Leviticus reference that foreigners were not supposed to be part of the assembly. They were not welcomed. They could not go into the temple later as foreigners. So now they leave Moab and they go to Bethlehem. So maybe Bethlehem is once again a house of bread. There's bread there. The harvest has returned, and they can go home. Well, Naomi can go home. So it's interesting. Why return? They had established a home in Moab, but why return? Was it because they had no choice? There really was nowhere else for them to go as a foreigner, Naomi being the foreigner. The famine is ending. We're not quite sure if it is or not, but we do know there's a significant harvest that's taking place. And with the possibility of being able to eat, they suspect they have a better chance of surviving by going back to Naomi's home in Bethlehem. Now, some have suggested that it was written as the people in exile were returning to Judea from Babylon. So now we're way ahead of everything, and it's like they're placing the story of David's lineage in the context of what they were experiencing going home back to Jerusalem and the land that the Babylonians had taken and destroyed, by the way. But I'll have to do a study on the exile period another time. It's a fascinating experience too. But they were coming back, and those folks in the exile, they'd been in exile for like 70 years. Those who are returning had never even been there. But those who were pure had married foreign people, which meant their offspring, which was coming back, they were part of God's people, they felt, and they were not welcomed. Now, interestingly, we learn from I forgot to write the prophet's name down. We learn from a significant prophet in the Old Testament that those with foreign blood, half-breeds, to put it callously, even if they were faithful to God and wanted to worship in the temple, God was their God, they were expelled from Jerusalem. They were not welcomed in the temple. And they went to where? Samaria. Did you get that? Why do the Judeans hate the Samaritans so much, who saw themselves as equal to the purebred? Well, that's a rivalry that was fought for centuries, and they were the Samaritan people. So if you're reading the Book of Ruth in that context, you can see how outrageous the book was to the listeners of the Hebrew people. Because you can't have foreigners be significant in the history of Judea, right? They didn't know their Bibles. They should have been asking, what else does the Bible say? So maybe the Book of Ruth was written to encourage more inclusiveness. After all, Ruth was a Moabite, and she was the great-grandmother of King David. She was in Jesus's lineage. So stories can be highly effective in many different settings. They are alive, and this is quite a story. It demands a search for meaning, and that's what we are doing. The Book of Ruth invites us into the story. It's a living word of God. That's why we call the Bible a living document. It invites us in to be part of the story and the journey. So Deuteronomy is also being referred to, because they didn't know what the Bible said, they should have anyway, is this very clear in that we are to care for the orphan and widow. Isn't that something? The orphan and the widow. And the foreigners in your midst. So here we have the situation that spells it out. A widow, she brings her daughter-in-law, who's considered an orphan at this point, we think, maybe. We don't know anything about her family. And foreigners in both locations. So, do we apply this to the story of Ruth and Naomi, and how does it apply to where we are in the world today? Oh, it's an uncomfortable truth, isn't it? For those who insist on calling the United States of America a Christian nation, how are we doing in that regard when we truly look at the Bible that is misused so often for our own personal gain? God is very clear. Jesus is very clear that we welcome the foreigner in our midst. So you're going to find those kind of difficult struggles all through the Bible. That's the way God works. He's going to challenge us every step of the way. So how do we as a Christian nation value the scripture? How do we do that? And how are we doing that? And how are we addressing the discrepancies? Those are some good questions for you to ponder and drive yourself crazy with. So what is the role of God in this first chapter? What is the role of God in this first chapter? God is referred to all the time. What God does in 1:16, and 17, it says, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. They're talking about God a lot. He's very much a part of their journey, even though he's just talked about. We have to think about a little more than that. What's this one saying? Hold on. Oh, God is talked about again. If you look at verse 20 and 21, they get back to Bethlehem, and the whole town goes out there and says, "Ooh, we're so excited!" And the women of the town, isn't that an interesting delineation? They were asking, "Can this be Naomi?" So some of them remembered her and her family, and she replied to them, "Don't call me Naomi, but call me Mara." Mara, M-A-R-A, very important name in the context of what is happening to them. Mara means bitter, and she was very bitter, it says there in verse 20. I went away full, but the Lord has returned me empty. Again, speaking of that barrenness of the situation in which they were in. Why would you call me Naomi, gift of joy and pleasure, when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has deemed me guilty? Ooh, that is kind of a bitter comment. Put that in context for you. And so they know God. He's a player in their lives. But what does God do? What does God do in this book? So to me, I think one of the reasons that it really attracts me is because God is simply a part of their lives. It's their faith that is carrying them through. And some of the questions that come out of that is, the grief that they must have been feeling in this trek back. What are some of the questions that a bitter, grieving person who's lost everything be asking of God in terms of relationship? Well, let's see. How about how and why does suffering happen? Why? And that's the problem of evil, in large part. I'm going to sneeze just a bit. Excuse me. So it addresses why suffering, Lord. And again, it addresses the fact that Naomi's mad at God, obviously, testified against me, he's deemed me guilty. I don't think Naomi felt particularly guilty. I don't know if she did or not. She hadn't done anything wrong. He's turned from me. God is behind what has happened to me. Ooh. Now, anybody who's suffered great loss and tragedy knows the first person you blame is God. We want there to be a reason for why bad things happen to good people. We want it to make sense. We want it to be reasonable so that we can maybe accept it better. But in this case, why? Why did this happen? So I think God's big enough to handle it. But one of the things they did know is that God was behind it. Okay, they can believe that. But that also is an indication that God is still part of it as well in their lives. And y'all can muse about that. It's kind of hard when you're going through a grief or a tragedy in your life. So the strategy that Ruth and Naomi are going to have to pursue is a strategy to survive. They were going to have to do something themselves. They weren't going to be instructed to do something by the men folks in their lives, their protector redeemers. They were on their own. So God is involved in the story in ways that Naomi doesn't have the imagination to think about under the circumstances. That's an important point. Does she stay there? Well, we'll find out. I think we know that. But one thing she does know is that life is hard and sad for them at the time. Let's see. We've had the covenant, the poem that Ruth said in terms of convincing her to take her. It is covenantal, and you can find more if those kind of covenants. 1 Kings 4:22, I had it marked and then I lost my mark. So just write that down in your margins and look it up and see if what I just said makes sense in connection to that. In Ruth, the language of family creating, the community, friendship, fullness, those things are part of what a family is and how a family functions. She portrays great family loyalty. It's a fierce kind of declaration and covenant with Naomi, which is interesting. You wonder why that was such a deep thing. What was it that happened in her life that made her willing to leave with her mother-in-law, which is quite unique. Let's see, what does that say? If we still stick around in chapter 1. Oh, talking about God, that's where I was. Naomi said to her daughter-in-laws in verse 8, "Go, turn back, each of you, to the household of your mother. May the Lord deal faithfully with you." Her Lord. That's the Lord, the God that Ruth said was going to be her God. May the Lord provide for you so that you may find security. Isn't that interesting? Each woman in the household of her husband. Then she kissed them and they lifted up their voices, and that was when they said, "No, no, no, we're not going to leave you." So you have to wonder why, but we don't know why. Okay. So this is an important part that we're going to end with in today's lesson. Where is this? Man, I think I've lost my way. Hold on just a second. Fierce language. Oh, it was a word, and I'm not sure which one it is now. Loving kindness, hesed. The kindness that she's asking them to have, or may the Lord do this. Hesed in 1:8, may the Lord show kindness to you, is what that word technically is. in verse 8. May the God deal faithfully with you. I don't like this translation because the Hebrew word is hesed, and that's kind. And just think about kindness. Our world needs a lot more kindness today. And I think that God deals more kindly with us than we deal with each other, that's for sure. But it's a covenantal word. What does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. It's a fierce word. It is. It's not, oh, kind, isn't he? Aren't he sweet and kind? No. It's a deep, deep word. What does it mean to be kind? And even more important is why is kindness mentioned so frequently by God in terms of how we are to respond and as he responds to us. So Naomi is empty, as is Ruth at the moment. Her fullness in her sons is gone. But in chapter 2, things begin to turn around for them. Now, it's a reversal of the book of Job. And for those of you who are in the Job study with me, you know what I'm talking about. This book, Ruth, this story starts in the pit of despair. Job started with, ooh, everything is wonderful. And then he goes into despair. But in Ruth, it begins with despair and it moves into happily ever after and fullness and good stuff, which I think is an interesting way to look at both these stories and what they say about God. So Job starts at the top and goes down to the bottom, and Ruth starts down at the bottom and she goes way up, as you know from reading the whole thing. Now, it is interesting, though. We know that grief changes you. Your appearance, life does that just based on your experiences that you have. And they weren't sure that Naomi was who they thought. Her state in life had changed her. They didn't recognize her at first. So she's a different person than when she left. Her identity of who she is has changed dramatically as well. Her life, Naomi's life, and Ruth's life are going to be recreated in the context of the house of bread in Bethlehem. So it's a clean slate in that regard, but they also know that it's something of their responsibility to make an impact, to become something new, and in this barren life that they have come from. So that is where we're going to stop today. I want you to read on to chapter 2 for next week. And I hope you are already seeing how the story and the setting and the context and the people and the names all intertwine to really pull out the significance of this book and why it's in the Bible. So at any rate, I love it, and I love that you have joined me tonight. And I just pray that this next week, if you have questions, be sure you send them to me via email or thoughts that you would like to share. And we'll see if we can't flesh them out a little bit at the beginning of the next one. So again, my church email is RebekahMall@wakeforestpres.org. You can find it on the Facebook page and on the website. So at any rate, I love you. Have a wonderful evening. And I will see you next Sunday for our third week in our journey of Lent. And I love you. Thanks for joining us tonight. And I'll see you next week. Bye.